Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I would like to welcome you to this special ACW conversation on the implications of Ukraine war on the Middle East with Dr. Daniel Brumberg, Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University and non-resident Senior Fellow at Arab Center. Daniel is universally recognized academically for his expertise on Iran, Arab Gulf countries, and various issues pertaining to democracy, human rights, social and political change in the Middle East. Dan, welcome, and thank you for spending this time with us to help us decipher a bit more an important yet not so widely covered aspect of the crisis in Ukraine, that is the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the Middle East. As we speak, and as everybody knows, this is the fifth day of the Russian invasion. Delegations from Kiev and Moscow are holding direct talks on the Ukraine-Belarus borders to try to resolve their differences. However, very few observers that I could tell are overly optimistic about the diplomatic outcome, particularly as Russian attacks on Kiev continue and fighting still rages in various and resisted in various Ukrainian cities. Indeed, CNN reported this morning, just a few minutes ago, that new satellite imagery shows a miles-long convoy of Russian military vehicles bearing down on Kiev despite these negotiations. Daniel, are you optimistic about these talks, and do you see room for diplomatic resolution to this crisis?
No, Khalil, and thanks very much for that generous introduction. I'm not optimistic at all. I think that the Russians are using the talks as a stalling tactic or camouflage, that Putin is very much directing the show and is committed now to destroying the government in Kiev and imposing his will on. And so I don't see the talks as providing any real hope. There has to be a real stalemate between the two sides for some prospect of talks to be meaningful, and I don't see that at all. So I'm not optimistic at all about the talk.
Are we correct when we assume that Putin seems to look at this conflict as a zero-sum game from his perspective?
Yeah, not only does he look at it as a zero-sum game, I think that he's committed to pursuing this war in ways that are surprising probably some of his closest allies and even some of the people in his inner cabinet. I think there was a really interesting piece I think it was in the Post today, about whether he's acting rationally, and there's a sense, particularly in the last couple of days where he put his nuclear forces on alert, that he may be more a character from the movie Dr. Strangelove than a rational actor. I mean, there's real concern here, and I think it's justified because he's taken this. There was no reason. Graham Allison put it very well in an interview with Harvard professor. There was really no reason for him to sort of make this latest move. Why did he do it? So there is concern that he's pushing this conflict way beyond the limits of what the international community expected and what maybe some of his own advisors anticipated.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, last week, I think it was on Tuesday, I watched you on a panel sponsored by our colleagues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, dealing with the regional and international implications of the Ukraine war. The crisis in Ukraine has clearly spilled over way beyond the borders of Ukraine or even the borders of Europe. How and why is the Middle East, particularly the Arab world, being impacted by this essentially historical European conflict?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and it's a fascinating question. Who would have expected a few years ago that a conflict over Ukraine would have had such implications for the Middle East and the Arab world? And that is largely because Russia has been a very astute player. Russia has diplomatic relations with Turkey, with Israel, with Iran, with Syria. And it's precisely that dimension of its relationships which has allowed it and provided it kind of geostrategic depth, apart from, of course, its role in Syria, to play a very astute hand. And now what we see is that it's going to be much more complicated because particularly Turkey and Israel have important relationships both with the United States. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey supported Ukraine's possible application for Ukrainian membership to NATO. And Israel, of course, has close relationships with Ukraine. There's a big Jewish population there. The president is Jewish, the son of Holocaust survivors. I mean, it's so Israel and Turkey in particular, who have now been recently exploring the possibility of some sort of rapprochement, have to sort of tread very carefully. It's a little different with Iran and Syria. They've come out quite clearly in favor of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but for Turkey and Israel, it's a much more complicated game, and they're really walking a tightrope. So, because Russia plays this very interesting role in the region, and because many of its quasi-allies and allies or whatever have interesting and important relationships with the United States and Ukraine, and the conflict has escalated to this point, it's really creating a tremendous amount of uncertainty for all the key players.
Thank you. I guess, you're right. It's a function of the extensive and recently kind of expanded Russian role in the region, taking probably some advantage of the fact that the U.S. Has been drifting away slowly from its Middle East commitments. But, I'm intrigued by another aspect of this implication for the Middle East, which is the humanitarian one. Very few people are noticing that, and it's getting very little coverage. But food and agricultural experts over the past few days have been warning us about potential food price spikes and even food riots in Africa, Asia, Middle East in particular, the Arab world in particular, because of this war. I would even venture to say that most of the public might not be aware that Ukraine, being the breadbasket of Europe, has been blessed with some of the most fertile land on earth. As an example, Lebanon gets 50% of all its wheat consumed by the Lebanese people from Ukraine. Yemen imports 22%, Libya 43%. Egypt, huge amounts, 14% of its wheat comes from Ukraine. To what extent do you believe this humanitarian implication is going to unfold before our eyes over the next few weeks?
Well, it's a great question. Let's not forget that Stalin's policies towards the Ukraine were premised on the assumption that he could extract as much of the surplus of wheat production and decimate the peasantry. That was called collectivization back in those days. And so I think you're absolutely right. When Ukraine's unable to export this wheat to many of the Arab countries, it poses a huge humanitarian problem and exacerbates existing humanitarian problems in countries such as Lebanon and Syria. I might also add, Khalil, it's instructive to consider and contrast the international response to events in the Ukraine with the international response to events in Syria and the Russian role there. There's no doubt about it that where Russia uses its force, its lethal force, and against whom makes a difference in terms of how the international community will respond. But Russia has a really interesting sort of strange advantage, and that is because of mutually assured destruction, because of the nature of this standoff, the Russians assume quite correctly that the United States is not willing to go directly to war with Russia. And this gives Russia, strangely enough, a certain amount of latitude to behave in both Syria and in Ukraine the way it chooses, because it assumes, and the United States has really effectively confirmed this by saying, both in the case of Syria and the Ukraine, we're not getting involved. Our former Secretary of State put it very succinctly on Syria. He said, we're not going to war with Russia in Syria or over Syria. So that is a context which really sort of frames the Russian response and to some strange way plays to its advantage, but also illustrates that there are very different international responses when the Russian threat is in the heart of Europe, Eastern Europe, and when it's in the heart of the Arab world. That's just a geostrategic and humanitarian reality, I suppose.
You did mention, and I'm glad you did, the nuclear item, or if you will, the nuclear factor in this crisis. And I'm curious, I mean, why Ukraine is not a threat, nuclear threat to Russia. Essentially, it has been disarmed nuclear-wise. And why would the Russians put an alert on their nuclear weapons yesterday?
Well, there are really two sort of competing explanations or hypotheses. One is that this is just a negotiating gambit. They're escalating, and the U.S. is treating this as a kind of escalation, part of a negotiation. We are not responding by putting our nuclear forces on alert, which is very smart. That would be a wrong response. And this is a calculated and very risky effort to sort of up the ante. The other explanation, which I was alluding to before, is that Putin is not acting rationally. He sees the imposition of sanctions, and particularly the decision by the United States and Europe to remove Russia from much of the SWIFT currency exchange system, as an escalation that threatens the Russian state itself and is aimed at really toppling Putin. And if he sees it this way, he may see the escalation as necessary and a more strategic than merely tactical kind of maneuver. And that sort of really raises. So it really depends on sort of how you judge his motivations and what you see to be his ultimate aim. Again, to go back to what I was saying before, Israel and Turkey obviously are very worried. Israel has, on the day of the Russian invasion, Israel had nothing to say, certainly the prime minister. But the foreign minister had a lot to say, and it was sort of a division of labor. They're walking that fine line. And I see the foreign minister of Israel today said, Israel will be on the right side of history and will step up and support Ukraine. But it's a very difficult situation because who will hold back Putin, right? Whether he's acting rationally or irrationally, it's a big question.
With regards to this item that you just mentioned, the reaction of the Israeli government, it is, I also found interesting, the silence, the first at least a few days of the crisis there by particularly the prime minister. It seems like Israel is somewhat kind of conflicted over its reaction in spite of its unique relationship with the United States. Was this hesitance a function of maybe the weak relationship with this administration, or why this hesitation on the part of the Israeli?
Yeah, it's certainly a complex and evolving relationship, isn't it? I think you're alluding to that, and I think sometimes more is made of the perception that the U.S. is withdrawing from the region than the reality, if you look at the deployment of U.S. forces. But I think the Israeli reaction has a lot to do with Syria. And Israel feels it needs a wide berth to attack Iranian or pro-Iranian forces in Syria. It has an understanding, we now know this, with Russia over the nature of those attacks, and that they will not be, that if Israel launches attack, Russian troops will not be hit. But a few months ago, inadvertently, Russian troops were hit. It seemed to violate that sort of red line there. And so the friction created by the current Ukraine crisis worries Israel, because it could be that Russia will start to, if Israel moves too blatantly against Russia, Russia will retaliate in Syria by making it much more difficult for Israel to maintain that understanding with Moscow about the nature of its targeting of Iranian or pro-Iranian Hezbollah forces and all the rest of it. And so once again, to go back to your initial question, it's very entangled. And I think Israel is acting strategically here. And it understands that it doesn't want to too much anger the Russian bear, because the bear might retaliate in Syria in ways that would affect Israel's security, or might lead to a breakdown to the sort of relationship which has really established lines beyond which Israel is not willing to go in Syria.
Yeah, I'm sure you did see the media reporting that the Ukrainian president was entertaining yesterday or the day before, asking Israel to mediate with Putin. Do you think this is a kind of a realistic expectation based on what you just said?
I mean, it's a sign of desperation, I suppose. I mean, it's sad to watch the president of a country put on military fatigues and a helmet and go and prepare for the worst and talk about his own fate and that of his family. It's a legitimate view. It apparently has influenced the decision of the international community, which illustrates the importance of leadership. I mean, his response really got the attention of the Europeans. But I don't think Israel is in any position to negotiate here. I mean, it's a great question because there needs to be some sort of actor who can play that role, but it's not obvious who could do it right now. But Israel certainly is not the one to provide a negotiator or a facilitator.
You did refer a couple of minutes back to the role of Turkey. That brought to my memory an article I just read earlier in this crisis by Jeffrey Mankoff, who teaches at one of the military colleges here, saying that Turkey could lose big in the Russia-Ukraine standoff. Why would Turkish foreign policy and relations with NATO and Russia be vulnerable in this regard in the midst of this crisis?
Well, Turkey has been playing a sort of difficult hand in Syria and the region because it essentially, it opposes Assad, right? And yet it's part of the Russian Astana process, a process that Moscow has led and constructed to provide an alternative to the Geneva talks over the political future of Syria. So just like Israel, Turkey has to be sort of very careful about sort of how it's going to be perceived in Moscow, having supported NATO, Ukraine's membership in NATO, and been on the side, on different sides in other regional conflicts. It could be that Turkey will find itself at odds with Moscow, yet not necessarily in a position to depend on the United States for cover in Syria that it really wants. So it's a difficult position for Turkey. And prior to this, or in the lead up to this, Israel and Erdogan had invited the Israeli President Herzog to Istanbul or Ankara for talks. An amazing move given the sort of coldness of their relations. But you can see Turkey basically trying to do its best to find a way to manage these tensions now that they're just getting magnified by the Ukraine crisis.
A couple of days ago in his latest column in Al Jazeera, our colleague Marwan Bishara remarked that, and I'm quoting him, "The world is united on Ukraine, divided on America." And he argued that as Cold War II rises on the horizon, the world seems to be wary of taking sides. Does this explain the hesitant position taken by several US allies? We talked a little bit about Israel, but the UAE abstaining, Turkey, Egypt, and even Brazil, for example.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. They all have important relationships with Moscow. UAE has been trying to mend fences with Assad, and so they're really hesitant. It's very difficult to see how this is going to play out in terms of sort of the authority that the United States has or does not have in the Middle East, because really the Biden administration has been sort of confronted by some very basic choices now that Russia has pushed this. See, one of the downsides for Russia of pushing this so far is it really is providing an impetus for the allies, for EU and for NATO to unify in a way. And a lot of the tensions between NATO, the United States, and Turkey, for example, over the deployment of Russian missiles in Turkey, which really sort of helped to sort of undermine that relationship. Suddenly it's a sort of new ball game. And so how the US responds and how Biden does or does not project leadership in the Ukraine crisis could translate into a sort of different reality as the players look. And of course, the outcome of the conflict is going to be critical. So who prevails here? If Biden and NATO and the European Union are able to somehow, and it's far from obvious that they will, push Russia out of Ukraine and get some sort of reasonable outcome, this is going to affect all the perception of American power throughout the region. And as I said before, I sometimes think that the perception of U.S. withdrawal is perhaps exaggerated. And so we'll have to see. I mean, it's a great question. Everything is up for grabs. And I might add, too, I think it's important to recognize that at the very time that this is happening, Khalil, as you know, there are talks in Vienna over the nuclear question, the JCPOA. And what's amazing about this is that it seems that the negotiators, and I'm sure Rob Malley is partly responsible for this, have built something of a firewall between those talks in Vienna and what's going on not so far away in Ukraine. And we may see an agreement to revive the GCPOA coming out this week.
Yeah, it looks very close, but do you think this firewall that Mali has built to protect the process is going to withstand, if you will, the fallout from the Ukraine crisis? Will the Vienna talks be impacted, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question because I mean, this crisis is going ways that, you know, that will be harder to maintain that wall, won't it? But I think what gets the Russian and American and Iranian attention here is that the alternative is a failed agreement. And a failed agreement is going to be probably worse for all the sides. I think this is the ultimate reason why the sides are pushing towards an agreement, because they understand that a U.S.-Iranian war is in nobody's interest. And if there's no agreement, there's really two options: some sort of containment strategy, which really doesn't stop Iran from building up its nuclear program, or U.S. Iranian military conflict. But I do think it's going to be harder to maintain that wall. And I also think that even if there is an agreement, we can see that on the Hill here in Washington, there's going to be massive opposition to this agreement. And just as the United States is imposing sanctions on Russia, massive sanctions with its allies, a readiness of the U.S. to withdraw sanctions from Iran will be seen as inconsistent or will be assailed on Capitol Hill. And so I think that apart from the Ukraine conflict, it's the domestic arena, and on both sides of the aisle, among Democrats and Republicans, they may demand that this become a formal treaty, and therefore Congress has to pass it, the Senate. And so it's quite possible that an agreement will come and it will be opposed in Washington. So the sanctions issue plays out in different ways, and it will be used to clobber the administration by the opponents of an agreement. So I think you're correct that one way or the other, that firewall is maybe burning itself out, if I might pursue the metaphor here.
Yeah. I agree with what you just mentioned a little while ago, that some of the countries, particularly those close to the U.S., including, allies of the United States, have been keeping a low profile for different reasons by different countries. But they include, for example, the GCC countries in general. However, one seems to be receiving a lot of attention, even though they have also been quiet, and that is Qatar. A lot of talk about a role assigned, if you will, by the United States in trying to replace Russian supplies of liquid gas to European allies. Is this doable, Dan?
Well, I'm not. The experts will differ, and I'm not an expert on this issue. I don't claim, but it's a really important question because the Nord Stream project, by which Russia is supposed to provide liquid LNG to Germany, is basically going to be shut down now. The Western powers have basically indicated that. That's a clear retaliation or response, and something will have to be done. And this partly relates to the Israel-Turkish sort of dialogue as well, to sort of supply. To make up for that supply loss. And the Europeans have determined that they cannot be dependent on Russian supplies anymore, that they're paying a high price for this. But the experts tell us it's going to take a long time for Qatar and other suppliers to sort of make a difference in time to sort of deal with this immediate crisis. In the longer run, of course, energy supplies from the Gulf could make an important difference, and that too will sort of reframe how a lot of these countries are seeing the conflict. And Qatar's the recent visit to the United States by Qatar's leader and the position of Qatar as a kind of non-NATO part of NATO, and sort of an extraordinary decision given the kind of conflict between Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia the last few years, and so this blossoming relationship between Qatar and the United States is very interesting. And I think it goes beyond the question of energy, right? It has to do with the sort of geostrategic issues and concerns. Yes. The the way that, for Qatar for its own reasons, and the United States as well, there's the meeting of the minds here that they both have a lot to gain. So it is certainly changing some of the dynamics here. But whether there is enough sort of supply to meet the demand in Europe in the immediate future, the experts tell us that it's quite unlikely. And so energy prices are going to rise precipitously. And of course, that rise comes not only from the actual element of lower supply, but also the psychology of demand, right? People just panic and they go to, it's a run on gasoline, as it were. And that's going to affect the markets as well. So the international community will pay a price, literally, for this conflict. And there will be some reassurance, given the psychology of the situation. The fact that Qatar and other suppliers are there and will step in will help to reassure the markets. I think that's an important element, even if, objectively speaking, they can't get enough supply in for the immediate future. The fact that they're there is going to have some impact on the markets.
Let's conclude with one important question, but I'm going to kind of limit you to kind of a one-minute answer, if you don't mind, to conclude this excellent conversation, Daniel. The Syria situation, you did mention Syria, but I want to ask you about the other side of the coin. Russian perception of its somehow success in Syria, the success of its policy in Syria. Did that impact Russia's invasion of the Ukraine? It got away with murder in Damascus. Is it going to get away with murder in Kiev?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's legitimate to say, if we go back to the Obama years when Assad used poison gas and Obama drew a red line and didn't enforce it. And a lot happened, in Crimea. There's an argument to be made that the Russians really perceived that as an indication of the limits of U.S. power, and that affected its move in Crimea and now again. And I think that's an important reality. The scroll back to what I was saying before, the Russians. Maybe it's not. Maybe the United States, in the case of the Syrian conflict, shouldn't have said we were unprepared to go to war with Russia. But everybody understands that. And Russia exploits that reality. So I think the Russian perception of its power and Russia/Putin, this is about Putin, right? His perception of what he can get away with is very important here. And I think that this is why what's playing out in the Ukraine will have such an impact in so many ways, including on sort of how the U.S. projects power and what Putin assumes about his own power. So again, here we are sitting talking about the Middle East, and here we are talking about the Ukraine in ways that are really linking these two and showing us that very much what plays out in the backyard of the Middle East now is a sort of global question playing out in the heart of Eastern Europe as well. It's a remarkable and dangerous moment.
Definitely remarkable and dangerous. Thank you, Daniel, very much for giving us this time and for answering these questions and help us understand the Ukraine crisis a bit better. You gave us a lot of food for thought. Thanks again, and thank you for watching this special conversation with Daniel Brumberg of Georgetown University.